Anyone know this rag?
No. Okay.
Pa ma ga ma ga da 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 ga da no. Bihag was a big rag, man. वो उस्ताद का राग है. Beautiful rag.
Yes.
Anyone know this rag?
No.
That's funny. Now I'm hearing an echo of myself.
Oh, okay. That will stop now. Yeah.
Now, Kamad.
Thanks, Srinivas. What a privilege to have a
Yes.
start like this. Okay, we just have another 2 minutes to go.
Yep. Now, Shanti che.
Hello, good evening, and it's 5, so we make a sharp start. And a warm welcome to all of you, and it's great to have you all. We have had an overwhelming response. And right now, just to give you a little bit about Takshashila, we're a public policy think tank. We do both education and public policy and research. And this evening, it's a pleasure to have Srinivas Reddy and Anirudh in conversation with each other about the book Raya. And I'm sure the curiosity levels are so high that we've already started receiving some questions. So over to you both, Anirudh and Srinivas.
Thank you so much, Soumya. Good evening and good morning to our friends and well-wishers from across the world. Welcome to our lecture come discussion on the life and times of Krishnadevaraya of Vijayanagara. May I begin by congratulating you, Srinivas, on this fine book, Raya, Krishnadevaraya of Vijayanagara. It is in many ways an unprecedented look into the life of a medieval South Indian king, his personality, his motivations and interests. Raya is packed with interesting anecdotes about Krishnadevaraya, who's arguably one of the Indian subcontinent's most famous monarchs, and humanizes him, updating his story for a modern audience and unraveling many of the legends that have formed around him over the centuries. It offers us, sitting here in 2020, a look at the great city of Vijayanagara in its heyday, a peek into its glittering, flourishing courts, temples, and literary salons, and a visit to the dusty, contentious battlefields of the 16th century Deccan. Over the course of the next half hour or so, we will all be treated to a brief lecture by Srinivas on the life and times of Krishnadevaraya, who stood tall over South India at this time. This will be followed by a discussion on Raya between Srinivas and myself. At around 6 p.m. or so, we'll open up the floor to audience questions, as Samya has mentioned, and I'm sure that Srinivas, who has worked on Krishnadeva Raya's life and literary output for nearly 12 years, will be delighted to help you understand that remarkable monarch better. Thank you so much once again for joining us all. Thank you, Srinivas, and over to you.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you so much, Anirudh, and Soumya, Nitin, Rohit, Apurva, everyone at Takshashila. Um, I just am thinking about the last time, I think a couple of years ago when I visited and we first all met, and it was wonderful then. And what you've all put together here with such support and love is just fantastic. And Anirudh is, you know, also such a wonderful historian and presenter of this material. And we did a podcast the other day, so thank you very much for that and all your work. So very honored and pleased to be here, and so happy. And I'm kind of glad actually that you did kind of ask me to do it a presentation, because I don't like lecturing, but what I did do is the last trip that I had made to see you guys, we also had gone to Hampi. And that's probably one of the main things I'd like to say, is that fundamentally what we call history, when we have it in an Indian context, history just means the present, the living, the embodied. That's what it means to me. And Hampi is the perfect example. It's still there. It's still alive. You know, it's not forgotten. You know, we may discuss declines and ruptures and all these things, but you know, history is still present, and people can go in and still experience that feeling. You can feel it there. So I'm really just going to be sharing a bunch of pictures that I've put together with some verses and different kinds of things, and taking you on a little trip, basically.
Fantastic.
So hopefully that'll be fun. Please forgive me if there's any issues. I will try to now share the screen and make the video presentation work. So let's try to do that. Okay, can you guys see this?
Yes, we can.
All right. Now I'm going to try to make it full screen so it'll look nicer. Is that working?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. So again, I'm just so delighted to do this, and thank you so very much. I will try to keep within the time we want to stop by in like 20 minutes or so, 25 minutes. Yeah, okay. So the life and times of Krishnadevaraya of Vijayanagara. I will try my best to do justice to that, and touch upon some various points which I find interesting, and which I'm just so delighted to talk about. So first, to get right to it, this is the image. This is an image of Krishnadevaraya along with his two wives, and talking about living history. You can go to this place today. You can see this. This is in Tirupati. This is right outside the Garbhagriha at Tirupati. And Raya is, of course, faced towards the Venkateswara, his Ishtadevata. But of course, when you visit Tirupati today, you're just filing through the very long and circuitous lanes to get there. And by this point, your darshana is almost going to happen. The Dwarapalakas are going to let you in and you're about to have your darshana. You're being turned, and it's around the curve when you come around the curve to go straight in. So a lot of people miss it because you really have to look back. You have to look back to see Raya. Now, there's a metaphor for you. You have to look back to see Raya, huh? And there's other Vijayanagara kings right nearby there, too. So the connection between, places like Tirupati and of course Hampi, they're all rooted in a very specific landscape that is not something bound by historical time, as in this is the 16th century. This is also today's century. You can go to this place. So this is what I'm saying, and people still venerate these sites. So this is the important thing I want to mention. We can get into some of the other details. Maybe I should quickly mention that according to the Portuguese sources, at least, which incidentally are very rich and wonderful. I mean, they're really the primary source, and we can talk about sources and other things also later. But an eyewitness account, which is extremely rare for this period of our history, to have an eyewitness account of the physical form of a man. And Raya was, had smallpox. He was a little stoutly. He did not look like this thin figure that we see here. And this, of course, goes into different things about how kings are imagined, how people are imagined. The other two other points to note on this quickly is the headdress, which is not the classic turban that you might see in other statues and interpretations. This is important to remember. And of course, Philip Wagner has done great research on this. You can read all about it. The other point is the two wives are represented here. This is Tirumala Devi, his chief wife, who, was really the main wife, the kind of politically expedient wife, the important senior wife, connecting to the Tamil country and in places like Tirupati also. And then, of course, there's Chinna Devi, his, beloved, his true love, who he knew from his youth, who was a dancer, and who, of course, was not of high status, but certainly was known to the court and was part of court life. She's right here, and we know that she held a very high place even within the court, if not, of course, Raya's heart. So that is the beginning. Now let us move and set the scene here. 16th century South India. This is the map from Raya, which my dear brother-in-law Zach Culbreath made. He's a wonderful architect and just an amazing human being. And my favorite part, I hope you can see them, is those little icons. The icons, forts. And, when you do things visually like this, you get different ideas. Zach and I were making this, and then I was like thinking, you see all the forts are all linked up. You can see with temples also. So this whole like political, military, agricultural, devotional thing is all mixed up and very complicatedly intertwined. And so separating them out in the way that scholars often tend to do unnecessarily, only make complicated things that aren't that complicated, So, but we have to think about certain kinds of things. And here we have four main players. So I put in little stars to make it look nice. Vijayanagara is here. Right on the banks of the Tungabhadra, which is, like a tributary, you could say, of the Krishna. Of course, this is the big debate, is this the Krishna or not? Because if the Krishna is up further north, that means that Vijayanagara has no say on it. And if it's down south, then it's different. So Vijayanagara is there. You have Bijapur, which of course is even a cognate word. Vijayanagara, Vijayapura. Same place, same. But of course, these are the great, one of the five Bahmani sultans. So they're up to the north a little there. And then, of course, to the east, you have the Gajapatis at this time, who were pretty powerful. When Raya took the throne, the Gajapatis ruled all that, what you see, Ahobala, Mudiyagiri. They were controlling all that stuff. And then, of course, which really adds the kind of global perspective now, is the Portuguese coming in 1498. And then in a very quick time, I mean, within like 15 years, like the Portuguese just took control of like the whole Indian Ocean trade route system, with these key ports, all along the route. And of course, Goa was a massive one. So all of this is coming together. And the other big theme I've been talking about in these lectures is just 1500. I think we even talked about it. 1500, 2000 years after that axial age is another axial age. Here it is, man. And I'm not talking about modernity in a lot of ways that others like to discuss. I am really want to talk about modernity in terms of the shift in an epistemology that happened. There was a worldview that kind of was in decline after the kind of pinnacle of someone like Raya and a pinnacle of a civilization like Vijayanagara. So this is what's going on in the Deccan at this time, in South India. Okay, so here are some pictures of Hampi that all of these I took on that trip. And, just to visit the place, I mean, it's magical. It's a magical place. You can feel it in the rocks. You can feel it in like the way the light, casts upon them, So I'll read just one small paragraph that I took from the book, and I'll highlight a few points about it later. The realm that the upstart brothers had claimed for themselves was the mythical land of Kishkinda, ancient home of legendary monkey warriors of the Ramayana like Vali, Sugriva, and Hanuman. There, across the arid plain, flows the river Pampa or Tungabhadra, gently coursing its way through barren expanses and breathtaking clusters of gargantuan boulders that appear to float in the sky. Harihara and Bukka's vision for their new dominion wasn't something preconceived. It arose from the rugged terrain before them, just as the city they would go on to build would seem to magically emerge from the rocky landscape. And that's the feeling you really get when you go and spend some time there. Now, right to get into it, because I know people, if you said Reddy gave a lecture on the life of Krishnadevaraya and didn't mention all of his caste and all his upbringing and all that stuff, let me put all of that in perspective with this point. Because here we're talking about Harihara and Bukka, the founders of this, a great Vijayanagara, and their connection, of course, to the Sultan of Delhi is another point of discussion. But the point here that I want to highlight is upstart brothers. Okay, these guys are not some big Kshatriya families from some Chandra Vamsho or Surya Vamsho or anything like that. These guys are local guys, man, like, local chiefs in that area who, rose to some power and things developed. And this is what's happening in various parts of India. So what I'm trying to say is that Raya, who again, of course, we all know is not of Kshatriya origin. Certainly, he's not a Brahmin. He was called a Dasiputra by his arch nemesis, the Gajapati, who, of course, was a ostensible Kshatriya from the Surya Vamshi, Gajapatis. So all I'm saying is that Raya is not unique in any way in that sense. We had kings of many different backgrounds for many, many centuries in India. So that's fine. What makes Raya unique is all these other great things, and the fact that he was not from a royal background is just one of many other issues. The other point is this Kishkinda, where these guys come, and this energy that you feel, like I'm saying, when you go there, it is magical, and it has that mythical quality. And that idea of myth and history and how they're interacting is a big theme I try to address. I wish I could have addressed it more. I mean, there's always so much to discuss and talk about. Sorry, I want to make sure the light's okay, because sometimes the sun comes. So the mythos of the place, it imbues, the worldview of the people who live there. And at Raya's time, people still did believe in those things. I mean, and in India today, there's plenty of people that still believe that. I mean, even in my own way, I when I go visit those places, like I'll show you, like Hemakuta, that hill, it has an energy and a power and a history to it that's there. I mean, I don't know if Hanuman came or Vali came or whatever, but I feel them when I go there, and I love that feeling. And that is part of what Raya captures in the way he like lives his life. And that was my big point, that these guys, they were myth makers in the way that they lived their life. They saw their life as a myth. They saw that they were like living out this myth that was given to them by destiny. They were myth makers because they felt like they were born into it. Like Alexander, living out the myths. Like Raya, living out the myths. Hmm.
That's an interesting point, which I hope we'll get into in the discussion
Huh.
later on.
Definitely. So here's a shot I love. This is that Hemakuta I'm talking about. This is looking up, down, from up top, looking down towards the main Virupaksha temple. Of course, this is
Yeah.
the tutelary deity of all of Vijayanagara. And the Pampa Tungabhadra is there just behind that there. And it's a beautiful shot because it also gives you a perspective. You can see the temples in the foreground. See, this shows an older layer. This is like 9th, 10th, 11th, 12th, 14th, century stuff. And then you
Yeah.
have, of course, the main Virupaksha temple there with the different Gopuralu that were done at different times and the layers of architecture there. You have the stone granite boulders. It's a very, evocative place. And layers of history. That's what I'm getting at. Layers of history, right?
In fact, the Pampa Tirtha, if I'm not mistaken, was originally a site of sacrifice where devotees would donate their heads to the goddess in return for various boons. And it was only later on that Pampa Devi eventually became associated with Shiva in his form as Virupaksha, and that eventually became a nexus of religious power that later became the site of Vijayanagara itself.
Yeah, exactly. So we can talk about that. I didn't even want to go down that whole. There's a whole big thing about the localization of large Sanskrit. This is all part of the whole vernacularization process, writ large. You know what I'm saying? How the mythologies get localized. I mean, there's 100 Kishkindas, man. Anyway. Okay, so let us come to Raya finally. This is, of course, if you can't be a bona fide like Indian unless you get a stamp. So here you go. Raya, and you have some beautiful stelae. I'll show some pictures of that. You have the cart there, and of course, you have the Tirupati bronze. Yeah. Okay. My relationship with Raya, why don't I close this a little bit, and it might make the light a little bit better. Or actually, you guys are watching the video. You don't need to look at me so much. So, Raya's main thing that I would always stress and how I got into him was because I was a student of literature, and he's a great poet. That's the amazing thing. You have a great king, a historical figure, well known, well cited, who also wrote an epic poem. And not only an epic poem, like one of the 5 great Mahakavyas of Telugu literature. So it's no small feat. It's a masterly work as a piece of literature by itself, and it's embedded with all sorts of important things. This, again, I have to probably address this at some time. The text was written in Telugu. There's a very famous Padya verse in there that is often cited, where Andhra Mahavishnu, again, a divine mandate, a mythical mandate has come to him in a dream, and he's going to tell us, God tells us that you must create this poem now in Telugu. Huh? And then he says, God says now in the dream, if you ask why Telugu, why do you want me to compose this in Telugu? It is because this is Telugu country and I am a Telugu king. Telugu is one of a kind. But this is the key line that people don't get to discuss enough, and we can talk about this in another time. And we've discussed this also. Yella norapul kolovan eragave basadi. Adi, that is the main line that you have to. Yella norapulu. All the kings, once they have gathered in the kolavu, in the sabha, so that means your officers and your lords. Basadi, once you heard those guys talking amongst themselves, discussing, didn't you realize Ergave? Deshabhasalandu Telugu lessa. The Telugu is the best of those regional languages. What he's saying is, this is the politically expedient language. The point one must understand about this verse, and I am saying it in no uncertain terms, is this is a verse about political language. One must understand this. Okay, we can discuss this on another point later, but let me continue. Oh yeah, I wanted to bring in this interesting element of the horse as maybe a little focal point to discuss a few things. Let me close this thing because it's kind of bothering me. It is nice to have the sun come out. Finally, a little sun. It was so rainy. 1 second.
Sure.
Is that better?
Yes.
Okay. Sorry about that. So here you have, this is a close-up. So many of these horse riders with their riders there that you can see throughout Hampi, and I'll show you a bunch of horse pictures. The horse was an incredibly important thing. It was probably the most important thing at least in terms of like what to acquire if you wanted to do battle at this time in the Deccan. whoever had the most horses and the best cavalry won. That was basically the equation. And to get the horses, you had to be in touch with maritime sea trading because the northern land routes were closed. And so the Portuguese are the critical players in here. I won't get into that triangulation of power. You know, Bijapur, Vijayanagara, Goa is a very interesting triangle of pitting people against each other, et cetera, et cetera. But I quote here a verse from Amuktamala itself to give an example of how a completely poetic imagination comes to life and actually embeds some very deep historical realities of the poet and his times. So soldiers need 2 stirrups to mount their tall stallions. But as the horses gallop and begin to crouch, their riders become scared as their feet graze the ground. Which of these 2 is worse? And what becomes of us? Think the proud warriors as they feign exhaustion, humbled twice over by these mighty swift steeds from Persia, Balkh, Herat, and Khotan. I mean, this is powerful stuff. Even to understand that verse takes so much time. We can spend so much time. I'll just explain it so people know. So he's giving, I mean, the metaphoric power of these kavis, the uha, the imagination is fantastic. So what he's saying is these soldiers are short guys. These stallions, these war horses, these are not like the Indian stags. You know, these are the war horses that are coming from, you know, Central Asia. They're huge. So they need stirrups with 2 levels on them to get up on these guys. Okay. So first they're like really short. Then the horses are so powerful and strong that they crouch down and they start moving really fast. And, you know, they get scared that they're going to get hurt. So now they're almost too close to the ground. So they're too small. So they're thinking which of these is worse. I mean, the imagination, but he embeds this critical thing. These horses were coming from Central Asia. He mentions them by name. Here we have the Vittala temple. You can see the bottom frieze with a bunch of horse images. Quite beautiful. Here's some close-ups. And these here, I am pretty convinced are Portuguese themselves. And we do have even the Portuguese, when you read in the book, they see themselves in paintings that were done in the palace of themselves.
Yeah, that was one of my favorite moments of the book.
Yeah, I love that one, man. That's the meta moment, you know. So anyway, promote trade by providing for ports and encouraging the sale of horses, wild elephants, jewels, perfume, pearls, and more. You know, so the importance of maritime mercantilism. Merchants from distant lands. These are words from Raya himself. Merchants from distant lands who import elephants and war horses. Now, they weren't importing elephants, but, you know, sometimes that dondwa, they come together, Gaja and Ashwa. So merchants from distant lands should be kept in imperial service at the capital, treat them with prestige and provide them with towns and mansions. You will find that that's exactly what happened in the historical account of the Portuguese. Here we have one of the most famous sites from Hampi. This is the great Gajashala. And you know, the architecture again. Now this is I'm moving into the theme of, you know, how Islamic culture, what they call Islamicate, you know, cultural things like architecture or, you know, parlance in government things or whatever, things that were not attached specifically to Islam as a religion, but came as a cultural movement. We're talking about, you know, many centuries of this going on, but how this has percolated even into the Vijayanagara architecture. This is the famous Lotus Mahal that's there, and the close-ups. You can see very interesting work. Here's some more close-ups. So the main thing to remember is this is a world of many cultures coming together, many influences. This is how Indian culture has always been. And to separate things out into, you know, categorical assessments of history is just missing out on all the fun and all the richness and all the beauty, and getting lost in petty things is just a waste of time. Now, here are some beautiful black and whites of, you know, what you might call a more traditional style with some temple work and then just the beautiful, you know, column work that's there. And again, this is all in Hampi. You can go there and see all of this today. I mean, I made them black and white, but they're right there. And that huge Ganesha, I mean, what a beautiful, you know, sculpture that is. Here now, you have the panel work, right? You can see the horses. I hope you can see the horses. You can see the ladies dancing. You can see all the fun that's happening, you know. And, you know, one of the great things is Paez, the Portuguese merchant that goes, you know, he actually gets to go to Vijayanagara and celebrate during Navami time, Navaratri. And in Vijayanagara, Navaratri was like just the most exciting time. It was the time when the officers all came with their armies. They made accounts. They paid salaries. They feasted. They did pujas. They did rituals. They feasted some more. Payas, all he ever says is, and then let's talk more about the feasting. And they were just partying basically the whole time, dancing, all sorts of fun. And yeah, it's all there. You see, what I'm trying to say is that the literary, cultural, economic, military machinery of the state was all happening as, as people like Geertz or others have talked, like a theater state. That's kind of what Vijayanagara really, was, especially in Raya's time. And that theater, in the sense of, again, I don't want to make it seem cheap or unreal or contrived. No, it was natural, and it really it expressed the vibrancy of what was happening. That's basically what I feel, and I guess part of why that vibrancy even has come to life even more is because of the haunting kind of ruins that are there. That it did have this kind of like sudden demise and disappearance. And so that in and of itself adds to the mythical quality. Even when Vidyaranya, has the kind of like founding, dreams, or I forget when or maybe some guru gives him the message, but it's like Vijayanagara is only going to last for like 360 years, and then it's it. So we knew it was going to be like a dream. We knew it was going to be like this moment of something beautiful and something special. So just last thing, I just wanted to show, I can't know if you can see it so well, but everywhere, again, to just talk about that kind of diversity and multiplicity. You have a Devanagari script, and above you have Kannada script, right on the same temple structure there. And this is all functioning without any issue at all. All those Tirupati inscriptions, Tamil, Telugu, Sanskrit. Very common to have trilingual inscriptions. So, I know I'm saying that Telugu is, particularly maybe dominant at this moment, but all of them were interacting together, and people, as they are now in India, are multilingual at a very just natural level. We don't have to go to school to learn 3 languages. We just do because that's what we do at home, and that's it. And that's what makes us special. I'll end now with this last picture, and I really want to thank John Gollings, who's just a fantastic photographer. If you see his book on Vijayanagara, please get it and see it. He's taken just beautiful, particularly black and whites. And I love this one with the buffalo herder and the temple in the back and the 2 gentlemen or 3 gentlemen there, the boulders there, because this is exactly what you see in people are still there. It's not like it's dead. And like, there's a life there that you can feel that still flows the way it flowed in Raya's time. That's the beauty of India, is that nothing ever dies. Everything just keeps going like a river. So when we were thinking of the book, I was thinking like, the cover, we knew, I really from the beginning knew it had to be like that bronze, because it's just, it's only one reliable, there's a couple other ones. The Chidambaram, I think, has one other statue, but I haven't been able to get a good picture of that one. The cover was going to be, so what was going to be the back cover? It couldn't be the bronze again, but I was just thinking what I wanted, and this picture just seemed so evocative to me. And it also, I'll just end on this point, is that I think having spent so much time with Raya, I feel like, you do feel like you get to know someone and you appreciate someone and you get some insight. This is a man who loved life and loved people. You could feel that. He loved going and like, chatting with cooks and clowns and joke makers and wrestlers and fighters just as much as he did with great poets like Pedana and ambassadors and statesmen like things against Gajapatis and sultans. So he was a very holistic type of leader and a holistic type of man, who was at one level a deeply religious man, clearly a Sri Vaishnava, clearly a cosmopolitan man, clearly a tolerant man, and someone who I think has a lot to say about how we can all, embrace a more kind of inclusive type of worldview by actually just looking back at our own past and how we were able to negotiate things like globalism and multiculturalism many, many centuries ago. So thank you very much, everyone. It's been a pleasure, and dhanyawadamuలు. These are my books. I'm just so happy that Raya came out. It was like the progression from Amuktamalya, the vis-a-vis Kalidasa, who I also love, to back to Raya. So thank you very much. If anyone ever wants to chat or anything, please just send me an email. And over to you, Anirudh. Thank you very much. Namaste.
Thank you so much, Srinivas. Thank you. That was an absolutely lovely lecture, and I really loved that last couple of minutes where you talked a little bit about the character of Krishnadevaraya. And I think in a lot of ways it really emphasizes what a unique individual he is, in the sense that he's left us with this rich body of evidence to actually reconstruct his personality with, which is almost unprecedented for any Indian king. Which I think is what makes your book Raya all the more unique. It's a very unique sort of look into the mind of this Indian king. There's a whole bunch of themes that came up during this discussion and while I was reading your book that I want to get into. And the first is I think the way that you used the legends of Krishnadevaraya almost as a kind of historiographical tool to kind of unpack the way that people perceived the king in his time, right? So you talked about Krishnadevaraya's romance with Chinna Devi. There's even oral legends of his friendship with his mentor figure, Timarasu. So to start off the discussion, can you tell us a bit about his historical relationship with Chinna Devi and Timarasu? Second, can you tell us a bit about how these relationships are talked about in oral legends that still survive today? And third, how do you go about deriving historically useful information from these tales?
Great question. So the first two I could take together because, the way I know those stories is best because I saw them in the movies. The movies that were produced in Andhra, in Telugu, in the 50s and 60s, I feel absolutely are supreme, man. I mean, just absolutely. I mean, they melded, you can go and find Tikkanna's poetry in those movies. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
Then you'll go later on, you'll find Venkata they're doing it later. But anyway, what I'm saying is they imbued, I mean, you had to be a great poet or published poet, to write a script in those days. So this is serious stuff, very, very serious stuff. And particularly Telugu cinema. Telugu cinema was famous for these Pauranika type of movies. They're really, NTR and the Savitri and those guys. I mean, just watch those movies. They're classics. I mean, untouchable movies. So one of them is Mahamantri Timurasu. And they never made a Krishnadevaraya movie, by the way, in Telugu. Kannada lo ochindi. In Kannada they have. I don't think in Tamil. In Tamil, Krishnadevaraya is not as much enjoyed. I got one comment the other day from somebody that said, he should not be an emperor. This is not an empire. This is not great at all. So, those are funny discussions to have. Yeah. Anyway, I got off topic. What was I saying? Sorry.
So you're talking about Telugu cinema and how their
Mahamantri
so, Timarasu.
a movie, the Timarasu movie, you get the whole story of Chinna Devi and Tirumala Devi and Annapurna, who's the Gajapati queen. That's his third wife. We didn't discuss the third wife. So Chinna Devi, like I said, was his dancer wife that he loved before. Tirumala Devi was the senior wife who he had to kind of marry for political reasons. So Timarasu, who was always he called him Appaji. He was basically like his father figure and advisor, and basically took care of everything for him. I mean, he was like, the ultimate, figure of the trusted minister. Of course, then you read the last chapter and you find out, the sad demise. But, all of that is again, part of the myth and part of the story. But so what I'm saying is the way I learn them is through these movies. The way I then reincorporate that into history is you look at the kavyas that are written mention this kind of stuff, Like the whole Parijata is supposed to be about, Satyabhama and all this stuff, but it's supposed to be about Tirumala Devi. The kavya themselves are metaphors for this historical reality that's going on by these court poets, So that's one way. And then if we can find some information like Paez, I mean, I forget which one, Nunes or Paez definitely went around during his time collecting stories from people about Vijayanagara. So these were stories being told either right then or contemporaneously, fairly around that time, about Krishnadevaraya and his wife Chinnadevi. Like the thing that it was that she was his true love, that's in the Portuguese chronicles. So at one level, what is history? I mean, maybe those guys were making that up. Maybe they heard it from somebody else. Who knows? But it all adds to the story. It adds to the richness of the story that we have.
While we're on the subject of stories, I think the stories of Krishnadevaraya that children especially are most familiar with are the stories of his friendship with Tenali Rama.
Yeah.
So where really do you think these Tenali Rama stories come from? And we've touched upon this in a previous discussion, but how are they related to the Akbar Birbal stories of northern India?
So that's what I'm saying. See, myths are they're like templates,
Hmm.
right? So there are certain kind of like tropes, certain kind of templates, certain kind of themes that course through the fabric of many societies, but particularly strong in Indian society, like the king and his trusted, like clever minister,
Hmm.
right? That is a theme that's old, and that's why Akbar Birbal, Vikramaditya has his friend. I forget who his
The
buddy is.
Betal?
Yeah. So all of this stuff gets played out in different ways.
Hmm.
So what I'm saying is historically, we can't say that was a person, but there is a Tenalia poet, and
Hmm.
I'm sure that he was a clever, witty guy. I have no doubt about that. So it is history to me in a certain sense. I mean, did he tell those stories that we hear, like the really funny ones and the jokey ones? No, but it's coming out of that Chatu tradition, that oral tradition. See, history
Yes.
lives like this.
Hmm.
We're constantly asking ourselves, is this historical? I mean, like that question itself is irrelevant question if you understand what history means in India. You know what I mean?
I think that's actually a very smooth segue to the next question I had.
Huh.
I really like this point you made about the historicity of myth, the way that a lot of these kings, for example, thought of themselves as reliving these myths in certain kinds of ways. One great example, of course, is in the introduction to the Andhra Mahabharatamu itself, where Nannaya talks about how Rajaraja Narendra commissions the poem from him, and tells him that I have been hearing this. I mean, in my old age, I want to hear the stories of the Mahabharatamu again. What Nannaya doesn't mention was that Rajaraja Narendra himself was in the middle of absolutely horrendous family disputes. He was the Chalukya king of Vengi. He was caught in battles between the Cholas and the Kalyana Chalukyas of the Deccan. His
Ama.
son didn't even live with him because he preferred his Chola uncles. And you can see how seeing himself as a descendant of the sun and the moon, he would ask a poet to commission in my native tongue, please tell me the stories of the Mahabharata, which I want to hear in my old age, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Um, so this brings me to two somewhat complicated questions. The first, of course, is considering
Uh,
the fact that these templates, these myths are coursing through the veins of India's society. It's not just happening in Vijayanagara, but also happening in Bijapur itself, right? And by this
Absolutely.
time, the sultanates have all gone through their own process of Indianization. They are aware of the broader Islamic myths. They're aware both also of the Indian myths. How do these religious and mythical mindsets guide their foreign policies? How do they guide the way that Vijayanagara is clashing with the Deccan sultanates?
Um, you're asking how do I think the myths are driving political things or military things? Is it,
Myths, religion, also, of course,
yeah. So
because
now, okay. So now we have to now. No, that's the difference, Anirudh. Now be careful now. Huh? So don't trap me out. Be clear, and I'll answer.
okay, let's talk about myth first, and then perhaps
Okay,
we
I
can
was gonna
talk
say
a
you
little
want to talk
bit.
about religion? Let's go. I
Let's
mean,
talk about religion next. I mean,
हाँ
you're
ठीक है.
not okay.
हाँ myth को कर.
Yeah, so let's talk about myth first.
हाँ.
How did mythology guide kingship in Krishnadevaraya's time?
Well, the main thing I would say is, you see, there was a kind of also arc in Indian history. Another big theme, if you really want to talk about the theme, is the deification of kings.
Hmm.
You know, And this was an old theme, even in the old Tamil stuff. You know, the king was like, Kovil. Kovil was the king's house, not the temple. It's the king's house.
Now it's used for temples, right?
Huh. So, you know, even they talk about him. You're like a living Krishna. You're like a present day Rama. You're like an incarnation. You're an avatar that has come. So all of that is building into these guys that they're here to like set the world right. That kind of feeling is being promoted, and people are believing this too. I mean, in the sense, the way that we Indians believe so fervently. I mean, the way that people are into movie stars these days is the same kind of devotion that's given. It's like it's a type of a bhakti, So that bhakti requires a mythology. So those people are, even if you want to talk about it, take NTR. NTR is also a type of Krishnadevaraya type character, man. He always plays Krishnadevaraya. He always plays Krishna. He's Rama, he's Krishna. I mean, he again and then he becomes the Telugu political leader. Telugu Desam Party, the whole identity of a Teluguness that he created. I mean, all of that I see in this progression, of
Exactly.
myths,
That's such a beautiful point. And on the topic of that fabric of myths, that kind of that also has a nexus with political power. I think Vijayanagara's Mahanavami festival is a great example of that, right? Because it showcases the king's close relationship to the gods. He's publicly celebrated. He publicly worships Durga. Durga blesses the weapons of Vijayanagara. And Ronald Linden, I think, has written about this, the way that these public rituals almost seem to reinforce this idea of the king as this orderer of society, this savior almost. So that's fascinating.
Yeah.
So now, of course, let's get into the complicated question.
Why complicated?
Which of course is the relationship that Vijayanagara had with the Deccan Sultanates. Now, a lot of people, a lot of nationalist myth making has gone into this idea of Vijayanagara as the quote unquote last Hindu empire that was trying to defend the dharma, if you will, against these barbaric iconoclasts, which is not really the way that Vijayanagari kings behaved. I mean, you gave a great example of Devaraya II, for example, inviting Muslim cavalry officers, inviting Muslim artillerymen to serve in his army. But Krishnadevaraya, especially because of his success against the Deccan Sultanates, is often held up as an example of somebody who knew how to fight off the Muslims. Was that really the way that Krishnadevaraya himself approached foreign policy?
See, the main thing when it comes to sultans or anybody is when we're talking about the political stuff, enemy is an enemy. All of Raya's writing on it, and even if you look at his historical behavior, he was at a military political level, he was about, where are my borders weak? What do I need to strengthen now? Who's my most pressing enemy? Who do I need to defeat? All of these things. So the religion aspect and the political aspect are kind of separate in a certain way. I mean, apart from the kind of discussions that Wagner discusses and like I was saying, the Islamicate kind of stuff. But in terms of religion driving the political machinations of a court, I don't think that's true. I mean, I'm just thinking of a bunch of other things, just even the Akbar Birbal theme, the famous thing was that, all of these sultans had Brahmin ministers, like they had their own little Timarasus there telling them how to deal with all this stuff, man. You know what I mean? So, I mean, I don't know what is the religion question. I mean, it's to me, religion is just another thing, like what we were talking about literature before or language before. There's multiplicity there, and there's a tolerance and an intermixture between the two, and oh yeah, I know what I wanted to say. You mentioned this is like the national myths or nationalistic myths. This is pre-national, right? Sewell creates this in the colonial period. I mean, great Sewell. I mean, without Sewell, we wouldn't have so much good stuff, man. I mean, he translated that into English. He wrote this fantastic introduction. I rely on Sewell. I probably the most #1 book relied on, right, to write this thing. The other one was Rayavachikam, Wagner's work, which is also excellent, which then shows you now a post-Vijayanagara look back at all of this stuff. And there you can see now, after 100 whatever years after, now a little bit of an increase in that bifurcation of like, dharmic kings, adharmic kings, but that was not there at Raya's time. So this is an important thing to remember. So then it grows there. Then you have the colonialist narrative comes in. Wo bhi theek hai. Then you get that picked up by nationalist guys, like you could say. But that also gets picked up by great scholars everywhere. Everyone picks that up. Then you had a bunch of new guys like Wheaton, Agner, Talbot, all these guys, who are now complicating all that stuff. And so it's like an evolution, this discourse on how religion is perceived over time through both the inner Indian lens and then, of course, from people looking at Indian history from outside.
Okay, so I have two more questions for you, Srinivas, before we open up to the audience. So just a reminder to the audience, you can put questions in the Q&A box that you see at the bottom of your screen, and then I will read them out for Srinivas. So what I want to ask you, Srinivas, was you mentioned Krishnadevaraya's great rival, the Gajapati king. And the way that the Gajapati constantly called him Dasiputra, son of a slave girl. I find that more than a little ironic because the founder of the Gajapati dynasty himself, Kapilendra Gajapati, was just some low-born army officer who rose to the throne. And 2 generations down the line, descendants are calling themselves the descendants of the sun and the moon and whatnot. And they have a very, very acrimonious relationship with Krishnadevaraya, which actually leads to him at one point taking an recent Balakrishna idol and bringing it back to Vijayanagara. So can you tell us a little bit more about that rivalry and shed some light on the contentious relationship that Vijayanagara and Orissa had at that time?
Yeah, so this is a good question. And the mention of the idol is also another good example, which kind of connects to the previous discussion. So let me maybe just start with that and see where we can go. I mean, like, again, one of the main, tropes is, Islam arrives in India and there's a lot of temple destruction. Yes, their temples were definitely destroyed. And there's no doubt about that.
Yeah.
But again, a lot of times temple destruction was, again, not done through a directly religious intention or something. It was more just part of like, the conquest that was going on. So, for example, Raya removing an idol from a temple. Now, somebody could look at that and say that's just a sacrilegious act, right? I mean, it can be interpreted in those ways. But apparently, as I mentioned in the book, that was some kind of retribution for another idol that was taken from another place. So you feel like you're returning it to its original place. So anyway, what I'm trying to say is that sometimes these religious sites become localities, nexus points of other larger political kind of actions that are going on. And sometimes, yes, I mean, they're important for their kind of publicity, you could say. But I don't know if they were kind of like the driving motivations for that political act. I hope this is kind of making sense. Now, the Gajapati, again, this relates because generally in the Vijayanagara history, we think it's just, Hindu kings versus Muslim sultans. But, if you look at Raya's history, the main rival that he had was the Gajapati. He spent like his biggest, longest campaign in his youth fighting this guy. And again, if you watch, these movies, you can clearly see that the Gajapati was always playing that kind of like, you're an upstart kind of thing, looking at a caste differential. And this all comes down to us in history, in this oral tradition as well, that this was the kind of rivalry that they had between each other. So that is only to show that sometimes the differences that we have with our own people, like our internal, like ostensibly this is a fight amongst Hindus, is probably more acrimonious than a fight I'm having with, my Muslim neighbors to the north, per se. So again, drawing it on a religious ground is also not necessary. Let's just look at what was going on, and just to return it back to the political, as you're asking, that at this point Vijayanagara had lost a lot of that main territory. The Krishna River is the dividing point. It was the traditional dividing line, and at this point, the Gajapati they had come down, and sacked that entire east coast. What we consider coastal Andhra was theirs. All those forts, Kondaveedu, Kondapalli, all of it. Udayagiri, the main one down south, the main fortress was out of their control. And this was, as you know, something that Raya had from, the royal testaments that were left by his ancestors that said, on his deathbed, he says, these three forts are, not in our control and we need to restore them. And so again, Raya is fulfilling the wishes of his great ancestor, fulfilling the wishes, and he does in his life regain those fortresses, regains all of that land south of the Krishna, and then in fact gives the northern land back to the Gajapati out of his benevolence, then marries his daughter. So that's a little bit about the Gajapati.
One of the things that really drew me to Raya was your description of Krishnadevaraya as being on the gulf, basically, between an ancient Indian king and a modern politician. And I think his behavior with the Gajapatis and the Deccan Sultanates really exemplifies that like nothing else in his career, because I read more about the medieval Deccan, so the period between 600 to 1100, and there's so many examples from then of the Chola king, for example, entering the Deccan and seizing idols from there and taking it back to Gangaikonda Cholapura.
See, great. See, I didn't even know that. See, we should document these kinds of things. That's excellent.
Richard H. Davis has a fascinating paper about this, where he talks about how basically the gates of Gangaikonda Cholapuram were decorated with Durga idols that the Chola king had gotten from various other kingdoms. There was supposedly a Krishna idol that he got from Orissa, a Varaha idol that he got from the eastern Chalukya. So he'd actually taken them from temples and relocated them to his capital to show that I am the one who's favored by these family gods of other kings.
Yeah.
And that nexus between political and religious power, I think, is very, very important. And to see how Krishnadevaraya simultaneously is part of that tradition, but also in some ways through his engagement with the Deccan Sultan is trying to make the Adil Shah his vassal. You talked about how he asked the Adil Shah to kiss his foot, for example. And I think that's become a really famous anecdote from his life in recent years, especially because of monopolized rebel sultans.
Yeah.
But again, that to me is so fascinating, because I come across inscriptions from the medieval Deccan where Deccani kings force their vassals to come and touch their head to their feet.
Yeah, well, Richard Eaton wrote the article, the Kiss My Foot article about military warfare in the Deccan, and he basically recounts the Raichur battle and all of that. But yes, that is a fascinating point. So, what did you want me to talk about on that one?
No, I was just adding a little bit of context.
Exactly.
So one final question before I open up to the audience, because I already see some absolutely fascinating questions there. But you
don't want to keep talking? I want to hear from you too, Anirudh. This is very, very. I mean, you're doing some wonderful stuff. I also want to learn many things that I don't know, and I want to gather resources. And we should keep this kind of conversation going. It's very important.
Absolutely. I mean, thank you so much for your kind words, Srinivas. But I mean, this is about your book, so let's keep the conversation on that. My final question to you was about Krishnadevaraya as a literature, right? You talk about his Ashtadhiggajas, the elephants of the 8 directions, those great poets that he brings to his court, and all that. And in an earlier conversation, you told me about how Krishnadevaraya in many ways represents the absolute pinnacle of courtly Telugu. And after him, because of the collapse of Vijayanagara, because you have all these smaller courts, Telugu literature really doesn't reach that awesome courtly peak that it had during his time. So can you tell us a little bit about the history of Telugu literature leading up to Krishnadevaraya's time? In what sense does he and his court really represent the pinnacle of Telugu literature? And very briefly, what happens to Telugu literature after that? What happens to it in the Nayaka courts, the successors of Vijayanagara?
So you guys should have been there yesterday. We did the Hyderabad Literary Festival. This was exactly the kind of discussion we had with Afsar and TVJ. It was great. I think we'll do more of that too. You want me to give a whole history of Telugu literature now in a few minutes? Anirudh. I mean, let me put it this way. You see, the literature and the political, they're all working in parallel. And there's also counter streams to those that are also working at cross ends, so everything's kind of intersecting in these different ways. But at what you're talking about, this court literature, let us say, if you want to take it from Nannaya, you were mentioning now, from Nannaya to Raya, let us take, okay? So ostensibly, Nannaya is the Adi Kavi, that's where it starts. And that is the Anuvadam type, the Bharata and Ramayanas are coming, people are doing that. But you get this high Prabandha style, that really develops during this later period around Raya's times, 500 years later. Now, what I would like to stress, and then of course, the power structure is now at its pinnacle, and then it dissipates into these Nayaka states, and you do get Telugu literature being written, no doubt about it. I mean, Raya Vachakam, for example, is at that time. But look, that even the type of literature is different. Here we have like Vachakam. It's not a kavyam, right? You have directly a politically oriented text. It's not like an imaginative thing like this guy talking about horses and two stirrups. No, it's a different kind of. I mean, this was bell arts. This was high literature. This is literature at the highest level, is what Raya is doing. So, things go down in that sense. I mean, in terms of a dispersal or whatever you want to say, same thing is going to happen in parallel with the literary modes and the political system. So that all is moving in a parallel kind of formation. The point I want to make, and I made this the other day, like, being at the peak of something is great, but it means that everything after you is downhill. Right? So that's what we really see. And I'm not even saying, about Telugu literature or any of that. What I want to talk about is actually something a little bit bigger. To kind of bring it back to a more global perspective, and what I was kind of saying before is this 1500, this is a pinnacle of Indian civilizational thought that fundamentally is on a decline from then on, and quickly soon after dies out or is dying out. I don't mean to say it's dead. I mean, it's transforming. I mean, doing what we're doing now in a way is continuing that tradition in its own way. But that knowledge system and the pedagogy, that form, Guru Shishya Parampara, basically is really what I'm talking about. That system of training and knowledge and absorption within a tradition, that is really on the decline, unfortunately. That is really sad. Like the great gurus, they just recite verses from Upanishads, this place. I mean, my gurus, I just, I'm nothing compared to those people who truly learned, man. I'm just gonna get sad if I even think like how great that tradition is. And I don't want to bemoan anything. It's wonderful. We want to celebrate it. Like I keep saying, history is alive, and we must keep it alive. But it takes an active consciousness on the part of our citizens. We as Indians have just a precious civilizational gift, a heritage that is a gift not to us only, but the whole world. And we only need to value it more, because right now, outside people are valuing a lot more than Indians. So, I hope reading Raya will make people see just how beautiful all of this is and how much good lessons we can draw from our past. So, on that note.
Thank you for that, Srinivas. So let's open up the floor to questions from the audience. I'd like to begin with one fascinating question from Samhita Arni, which says, I'm curious about the treatment of Sita and Surpanakha in the Amukta Malyada. Raya writes in your translation, without any thought of Sita, he got into a meaningless war, and she suffered all the pain of abandonment and longing. Through Andal, he seems to be even sympathetic to Shurpanakha. I'm curious to know how Raya looked at Rama, looked at the Ramayana, and his relationship / patronage of Molla, who creates a Telugu Ramayana. Raya has a very different, almost critical take of Rama. Could you talk about this and explain the reasons for this?
Wonderful question. We can have whole discussion on Ramayana anytime. For the rest of life, I can go on talking about Bharata and Ramayana. I do love them so much. So wonderful point. I would say this relates to, in a general sense, without getting into the details or nitpicky things, but a certain Dravidian or South Indian sensibility about the Ramayana, about Rama in particular, and even Surpanakha's role specifically. If you look at, for example, in Kamban, I mean, this is, I mean, just a horrible scene. This is in fact the root cause of everything. Lakshmana's disfiguring of Surpanakha is an absolute crime, man. I mean, if you really just sit and think about it, it's horrible. So, in the Southern tradition, that critical stance on what Lakshmana did and Rama's kind of just like quiet letting of it happen, that has always been in the consciousness there, even in Kamban's time. I think certainly in Raya's time, and even in other places. So that's one thing. And then you mentioned mullah, very important. Obviously, again, not a Brahmin, not a male, tells a Ramayana. Mullah, I think, is from Kumbar caste or something. But anyway, that's not important. The point is that she's not from that high society and she's a woman. I mean, this is the kind of thing that was happening at this time. Amazing. And Mullah's Ramayana, which I hope to read one day, I'd love to read if we can do that, you know, uh, will have whatever little bit I saw, totally different flavor and addresses different things. And we would be very interesting. We need scholars to now go read Mullah on Surpanaka incident. I would be wonderful, excited to see someone do that. Great question. Thank you so much.
The next question is from Ambassador T.C. Raghavan. Makes me wonder whether in the case of Vijayanagara, its decline eclipses everything else and we see its final death throes defining its entire history. So I think that's a fantastic question. That ties into what you're saying about the myth building that happened.
That's what I was saying. Like a tragic end means that there was something epic that came before it. So it all fits into the myth. It adds to the glory almost. The Forgotten Empire. I mean, isn't that a great title? That was Sewell's title, And then I forget who did that sir's name, the Unforgotten Empire or something, So just that whole idea of memory and history also playing into all of this. You have to remember Vijayanagara, means you have to tap into a past to even kind of get there. That's what happens basically when you go to Hampi, which is basically a ruin, okay? At one level, you could say, yes, it's an architectural ruin. There's just boulders everywhere. But it forces the consciousness into a place of that retrieval, of imagination, of, recalling the past, recreating the past, and then having it happen in real time in a physical place is amazing. Now, if that was happening in a place where, as you know, in some monuments in India, we're now fixing everything and making it look like how it looked in 1509 or whatever, I think that's a bad idea. I certainly don't, maybe in one or two places they can do that in important sites in Vijayanagara, but the rest of it, the fact that it's sprawling boulders of ruins is part of the glory. That's what it is. So yeah, beautiful question.
The next is from Payal Chattopadhyay Mukherjee.
Payal, my dear student, and friend.
So from Amukta Malayala to Raya, you have been through a transition. In the first book, you have Krishnadevaraya as a poet, and the fourth, there is the king himself. So how were you thinking through the intersections
of poet and king? Yeah, so that's the whole thing. And maybe this could be a fault in how I approached writing this, but for me, reading the poetry is reading the king's life, is reading the king's mind, which reads in the most deep way, I think, into someone's deep subconscious. That's what I feel is so powerful. I don't know. Maybe you, and that maybe what I'm saying is that if you read Raya, you'll get a deep sense into who I am and it's true. I mean, I really spent time thinking about those things, and I really spent time thinking about how poetry, in hidden ways, see, it's not obvious. You have to meditate on a poem for a long time. I mean, Payal knows this so well. I mean, we did so much reading together and good times. And so she you will understand, but for others, just one poem, to meditate on that, to really spend time going into it, that takes you to a certain place where it becomes like a reality of that man's life and mind. So for me, everything that's written in Amukta Malayala is like a historical document. That's the point. So I'm reading it like history itself, or what a Western sense of a historical source would be, without any qualm or issue with imaginations or references to Indra and Gajas and flying monsters. You know what I mean? I don't know if that answered the question, but thank you, Payal. Love you.
The next is from Sunidhi Hegde, who's asking, Driving the conversation back to myths, how did people start believing a certain mandapa on the Tungabhadra was Krishnadevaraya's tomb? And would it be possible for a Hindu king to have a tomb given that Hindus burn their dead?
That's a good question. I have heard about this thing, Krishnadevaraya's tomb. I don't have any knowledge about the historicity of that. I don't think that's true at all. One thing, though, to remember, and this is important, is that saints are buried. That is a common thing that happens in India, and this also comes from an older tradition that Virakal, you know, the old, old Deccan, I'm talking about, an old Dravidian culture, the hero stones, the stones that were kept, some great hero died here, or a battle was fought, and Virappa won this battle, whatever it is, and they would keep a stone there, and this would be venerated. Like that, you could say it was something of that nature, but that would be it.
Fascinating point. Just an interesting anecdote I came across when you were talking about hero stones, Srinivas, is that apparently these were when warriors were going into battle, especially if they had known the dead hero, they would go into a trance through music or drums around that
Yeah.
hero stone before charging into battle. And
Oh yeah.
that is so metal, right? And you never think of Deccan armies like having such a deeply embedded martial culture.
Oh yeah, I mean, you read that part. I mean, like Paez again, they do it. They start banging everything. He's like, I mean, I felt like the whole sky was gonna fall down. And it's true. Like it's just so intense. So yes, they're martial culture is huge, especially what I'm saying. Like that's the element that comes in through these like local lords. It's more of a rough land. It's like the environment itself. This is not pasture land where people are sitting down and living agrarian life. These are more nomadic people moving around. So it's also about that geography.
The Deccan is very dry land, so I mean, by
Dry land.
definition, the competition is inherent to state formation in the Deccan. It's important to steal other people's cows and wealth and gain control of fertile agricultural land and so on.
Yeah.
But
Well, cow stealing, by the way, is one of the great themes. That goes all the way back to Vedic times. Of course, in Virata Parva, in Mahabharata, that comes. So, the cow stealing is an old one for Indian civilization.
So now there's a whole bunch of questions which have broadly the same theme.
Okay.
Let me try to summarize them. Basically, the idea is that the Mughals are so well heard of, right? They're constantly present in textbooks and so on and so forth. But why is it that Vijayanagara does not get that same kind of presence in textbooks?
Well, I mean, I don't know. It's like anything. I mean, there's 100 other things that don't get exposure either. You know what I'm saying? There's a lot. There's so much in our history. One thing we as Indians don't even have basic understanding of that history. I mean, I ask young people in India, tell me the 6 Mughal emperors. Many cannot do it. So even if Akbar is dominant in history textbook, even that information somehow is not reaching our children very clearly.
I have a theory on this, if you don't mind, Srinivas.
Yeah, I'll just finish up in my philosophical way and then go ahead. My point really is it's not about what's in the textbook. It's about that textbook itself and how we're teaching it, our whole education process, the fact that we're basically in a Western mode of learning, that we learned a lot about things that, we probably don't need to learn a lot about. So what I'm saying is there's a lot of issues at hand here, but I think the core issue is our approach to education and how we are teaching our children. Sorry, go ahead.
Definitely that. I think that's a big part of it. But I also think that when Indian school textbooks and history curricula were first being set in the early decades after independence, there was a need to find these unifying national myths. Keeping in mind how diverse India is, keeping in mind how deep-rooted a lot of local myths of kingship and so on are, I think there was a certain intellectual current in Delhi which tried to seek these pan-Indian imperial moments. And for example, the Mauryas, the Guptas, the Delhi Sultanate, the Mughals. There are massive gaps in history between all of them, right? Very few empires like the Chalukyas, the Cholas, don't get recognition, but I don't necessarily think it's because these are glorious Hindu kingdoms, which I think some of the questions in the that our audience has put up. It's not a deliberate conspiracy, if you will, to erase histories, but rather that India needed at some point to have these unifying myths. Large territorial empires based in Delhi at some point fit that myth. But I think that now, as a country, it's important to move towards more regional histories, right? You don't see a history of Europe that neglects the entire history of France.
Yep.
Similarly, you should not see a history of India that neglects the entire history of the Deccan, or
Yep.
that neglects the Deccan Sultanates or Vijayan.
Yep. So on this point, you have nailed it, Anirudh. Very good, because now you've brought it to the point of, this is a discourse that has been given to us. Why is Indian history told through Delhi as the capital, as the center? Why is the nation? Why is this? I mean, all of these concepts are what created this history. Even, early histories of understanding Indian literature. Why is Gupta considered the center of? I mean, this is all a narrative that has been created through, and this is a historiography that we as Indians also need to explore and to understand our own thinking today, and why it is the way it is today, and why our textbooks are the way they are, and why fundamentally, in many ways, we basically still follow everything the British told us to do in so many things.
Right down to the language we're conversing in right now, Sridhar.
Henna. So, bus.
Another great question from Samhita Arni. Another poet king to me who reflects some of this conversation about Raya is Mahendra Varman Pallava, who also is a great king in terms of leaving a legacy in stone and in words.
Yes.
I wonder if the poet king is also a mythic template of kingship as well in the context of Indian civilization.
Of course. I mean, that's what I've been talking about the whole book. I talk about it in the book, the Kavi Raja. That's what we've been talking. The Kavi Raja is the ultimate thing. Bhoja and Kalidasa, Mahendra Varman, Raya, all of these guys, it's a theme. Even like the Gajapati tried to embody that theme. So the Kavi Raja, the poet king, the philosopher king, the enlightened monarch, the person who can be a warrior and a statesman, but do it with this compassionate, almost kind of liberal, humanistic attitude. And that is the ideal. So you are absolutely right, who asked that question. And yeah, and the plays, I think we were talking about this the other day in another thing. The plays by the Pallava king are just fantastic. I mean, people need to do more research on that. And you call me one day, we'll work on something. So there's fun, really a lot. I mean, what I really want to stress, there's so much fun stuff, exciting stuff, interesting stuff. Anirudh, you know better than anyone. I learned all sorts of interesting stuff from your podcast, that I didn't know. That's what we should be celebrating instead of getting mired up in these silly discussions about things that, will go on forever, So why just get stuck up in that when there's all this fun to have? Yeah. Next.
One from Sanjana Naik. How do you deal with oral traditions and kavyas as historiographical sources, given their frequent use of metaphors to present their ideas?
So that's exactly what I was saying. So when their imagery is metaphoric, that's like a meta type of consciousness on a situation. So as a poet, or as a researcher, reading a poet, you have to really meditate. That's what I was saying. You really got to take one poem, close reading. Meditate on the words, the meaning, the context, so that you can really flow into maybe, oh yes, this is the deeper hidden meaning that the king or the poet is getting at here. And that takes also meditation on the work as a whole, right? The work in relationship to other works of that genre of literature. So all of that comes into play. But yeah, you have to, I guess in a sense, the answer to the question, I would say you have to meditate on that material for longer, and you have to, in a certain sense, unpack the metaphor. It's like a present, that's wrapped up. So you have to spend time and, do it and then open it, and then it will reveal itself to you.
From Sai Chandra K. Did you try reaching out to the present-day descendants of the Raya family residing at Anegondi of present-day Karnataka for any information?
No, I didn't. I didn't. I've heard that there's Raya's family in Anagundi and also some other places in. In fact, I knew one girl in the Bay Area. I think she said she was part of Raya's lineage or something. I'm trying to remember the funny word she used too. Oh yeah, you know, మామూలుగా తెలుగులో బాగున్నారా అంటారు కదా. So she used to say అటువైపు they used to say లెస్సగా ఉన్నారా, and లెస్సగా ఉన్నారంటే ఆ తెలుగు లెస్స, that also comes there. So it is a funny thing. So anyway, getting back to the point, I did not get in touch, but if someone has any contact to Krishnadevaraya family, I would love to meet, and I hope that I did justice to their ancestor and who I full namaskaram. Thank you.
We have a question from someone who hasn't mentioned their name, but is asking about the Kakatiya kingdom's relationship to Vijayanagara. I think this is a great point to also talk about the Rayavachikamu and the way that it ties into this foundational myth of both the Kakatiya kingdom and the Vijayanagara Empire.
Yeah. So Kakatiyas, I also want to do more research on all this stuff. And Cynthia Talbot did good work on this. And that Prataparudra Charitram, I think she translated some of that. Has a lot of the myths and stories. But from the basic understanding that I have, the Kakatiyas were the kind of main, you could say, other Deccani type power in that region prior to the rise of Vijayanagara. And, the first kind of onslaught of Delhi, taking over, that breakup of Kakatiya, a lot of those lords and generals or their sons became the lords and generals of Vijayanagara. That is the basic, not all of them, but many of them kind of migrated south. And even these Harihara and Bukka, I think, were kind of like part of that group. They kind of went back to their Kampili. I'm not sure exactly the details. I can get back to you on this, but their ancestral area, and that's kind of how it happened. So basically, a dispersal of from Warangal and down into Vijayanagara side.
All right. From Ayushi Tiwari, just wondering, Hampi being in Karnataka, how come Raya had Telugu as his mother tongue?
Raya's mother tongue, we actually think, was Tulu. He's a Tulu man. So Tulu is his mother tongue. I'm sure he spoke Telugu, Kannada, Tamil. He read Sanskrit. He wrote in Sanskrit. So he's, when you say today it's in Karnataka, that's a state that's only existed for, some 70 years or something. But Raya does, Raya does use the words in the mouth of Andhra Mahavishnu, but about, Telugu Raya, Telugu king, and Kannada Raya, king of Karnataka. So in those days, Karnataka meant kind of like, the south. That's what that region represented. You had the Deccan, and then you kind of had, all this stuff. So Karnataka, or what, Kannada, represented all of that area. Now, like I said, he was, in terms of literature, he sponsored Telugu, Tamil, Sanskrit, Kannada, everything. So the only thing I want to make why Telugu is important at this time is, it seems to me from the research I have done, that the majority of the king's political administrative system, in terms of officials and important high-ups, were of Telugu-speaking background. And therefore, it was the most politically expedient language at the time. It also was having a flourishing literary kind of scene. So all of this was kind of coming together. For this particular moment in time, Telugu was the, kind of dominant language, you could say.
And also ties directly to what you're saying about the fall of the Kakatiyas and the migration of that warrior nobility, if you will.
So that's exactly the point. Exactly. Correct point.
So another question from Ishan Shah. Any mention of Vijayanagara's largest importers? Did they have any specific influence developing over the years?
Importers?
Yes, importers. So where were they importing stuff from?
Oh, where were they importing stuff from? Means where the goods were from, or who are the importers? I didn't quite get the question.
Yeah, there's
like,
a little
bit
of
merchants,
ambiguity. It says any mention of largest importers. So I'm assuming he's asking both about the merchants and the goods.
I don't know so much about all the economic activity, from my research, like I said, the number one for me, and Raya talks about it extensively, and even mentions in his economic poem, budget poem, that a quarter, I think, of the budget is spent on these military needs, and the largest of which was to buy these war horses. And the main people that were in charge of these war horses, in terms of the maritime side, were the Portuguese, because they controlled places like Hormuz. And Hormuz was the place where all from, Central Asia, all the horses were funneling into that place. And then by ship, they were taken to the Deccan, because they were, the Delhi Sultan was there. So any horse couldn't make it past, the Vindhyas. You know what I mean? So you had to bring it down through. So, but then they would drop them off in places like Bhatkal, later, of course, Goa. That's what the Portuguese. What the Portuguese did was take all of that coastal sea traffic and channel it all into Goa, so they could tighten up everything. So they created these nodules of power along coastal areas, all along, the eastern coast of Africa, India, Sri Lanka, all the way up, and then finally they go to Japan too. So the point is that when they got to these ports, though, you had to interact with these local kings. Most of them, and sometimes you would pass between people, but many times there would be ostensible Hindu kings with many merchant communities, including many Muslims, all working together as like an economically interdependent, functioning port city. Ports, as or these places where all peaceful ports of stop, these places for people from all over the place are getting together. And those descriptions, you can read my papers about how diverse these places were, but those were the main things. Internal imports from the southern lands, they were getting elephants. That was another big one for the army. In terms of exporting things, of course, the Golconda mines and the great jewels that are very famous. Of course, Vijayanagara was famous for that. These things selling in the street in basket loads, that kind of stuff. So there was a lot that Vijayanagara had to offer people in terms of that kind of wealth and splendor. Gold, of course. But it was the war horses and the military stuff that they were importing, mostly done by Portuguese. And then, of course, localized, interdependent communities of various origins.
It's so fascinating to me, Srinivas, how far back this this geopolitical logic of the Deccan goes. You mentioned how horses were integral to winning wars at this time. I've come across coins from the Rashtrakuta period, which was in the 9th century, so more than half a millennium before Krishnadevaraya's time. And we have a coin of this remarkably successful monarch called Govinda III, who invaded North India and paraded his armies along the Ganga and Yamuna rivers. And we have just 2 coins surviving from his time. Both those coins are golden dinaras, which show him riding a horse, and they have the inscription Apratihata. They have a Vaishnavite symbol of the conch and the Garuda, but the script is pseudo-Arabic. So
Pseudo-Arabic means?
Yeah, so it is basically it's in an Arabic script that was being used by the Umayyads and later the Abbasids, and it's very obvious that at this time, look, the Deccan didn't have such a developed monetary economy. Most trade was being done through exchange, through in kind. So very clearly, those golden dinaras had been made specifically for the purpose of trading with Arabs to get horses. And I don't think it's a coincidence that the coin says Apratihata, invincible.
Yeah, wonderful,
and also
man.
shows him on a horse.
Yeah, I mean, and the horse. Look, the horse is one of the most old themes. We're talking about these big tropes. The horse is a big one, and there's a big debate on it. Is the horse indigenous to India or not? Let's not get into it. There's a horse. There's a horse in India. Let me put it this way and be clear. There's a horse in India. I can agree with that, but it wasn't a mighty war horse that was good for battle. That was the thing. So we always needed to import them. And even when they were imported, even back in the Vedic times, we know Ashwamedha. It's the greatest, yajna you can do. Right? Ashwamedha requires a horse, nah? So the horse in Indian culture, I wrote a whole paper about this. It just came out in a fantastic volume with these anthropologists. I mean, I have to really thank these guys at LMU. Little shout out to them. They're just fantastic work. The Martin Saxer, Philip Scorch, Marlena Elder, I forget her name, but anyway, wonderful work. Materiality, connectivity. Oh, it's all about this horse stuff. But what I just wanted to say was, from very beginning of what we know in Indian history, the horse was always a very prized thing for elite people. it later became this military machinery, which required heavy importation. So that's it.
So one final question I think we have time for.
Okay.
And please feel free to like wax on this at whatever length you see fit, Srinivas.
Don't get me started, man. That's dangerous.
Um, what would you consider to be the legacy of Krishnadevaraya to those who came after him?
The legacy of Krishnadevaraya to those who came after him was exactly what we've been talking about. His whole legacy was to create and live the myth, was to be the iconic king that they could call upon as their exemplar of modern times, and to say, that's our guy. That's what we're trying to achieve. He's our man. That to me is the greatest thing that he created. At the same time, as a literature person, I still think, and this is completely undervalued, that and it still will be, is that he is a great poet. For me, first and foremost, he was a poet before he was even this big. I mean, he was a king in the beginning of my life as a kid. You see the Amrachita Katha man with the one where he's fighting, he's throwing that flaming arrow. I love that, and those platforms. We have an inscription that talks about those platforms, by the way, that were used. So, this stuff really, creates a myth in as a little kid's mind, even from the beginning, right? So this is part of that mythology, creating that, living that to the best that he could. That was the legacy that he kind of like gave us, in a sense. But again, people will not appreciate him as a poet. He'll always be just a great king. He won't be a great poet. I hope people will see him for that, and I hope I tried to bring enough of that into it. I mean, please read Amuktamalya, though. Whatever I translated, I didn't even translate the whole thing. I feel like I could write a few more things about things in Amuktamalya that are historical. Like, there's that whole Rajaniti section, which a lot of it are incorporated into the book. I mean, this is 80 verses on political theory in the book. Then there's that whole story of Yamanacharya. Now, this gets into the religious thing, and this gets into maybe a theme that I wanted to also talk about that maybe we can close on. Is the idea that what is kingship? What is leadership? Leadership, the best leaders are the ones that don't want to be leaders. They have no asa for leadership. They don't want to be the boss. In fact, they usually just want to be left alone. But history and circumstance and that myth thrusts them to become the hero, right? To become that mythic thing. So like that Yamanacharya story that gets embedded within this big text, which is ostensibly a Sri Vaishnava text. Again, let's not forget how deeply religious this man and how he saw the world. What that does is there's a moment when he basically says, I'm going to tyag half this kingdom or this whole kingdom. And then these Rajaniti verses come on how to be a great king, and you can't just renounce. And there's even there's a story even in Paya's recounts where, when Timrasu says, okay, let's go, it's time to become, your brother's dead and it's time you become the king. He says, no. I want to pass this life as a yogi. I want to do tyag. But then it's the king, it's the man who wants to do tyag that's going to become the greatest king. Because if you're a king who's out there for power and fame and glory, that's not going to work. You have to be out there for something else. He was out there for the responsibility of that thing. He was out there for the duty of that thing. And then, it did go to his head. We didn't get to talk about his fatal flaw, which maybe people will have to read for the next conversation when they finish the book. But the main thing I would say is that Raya's contribution or his legacy is a rich memory, right, of a king who lived in India, who is historical, who lived this kind of magical, utopian kind of reign, and people were happy and things were wonderful. I mean, it just gives us something good to think back upon, reflect on, see the complexities of, and try to move forward in the best we can. Because essentially, all the issues that Raya is dealing with in his life and in his book through his poetry are the same issues we're all dealing with now. That's why, you were asking that, ancient king modernity. He's that step into that modern conversation of, how am I going to deal with people that not only are of different communities, like I might have been dealing with Hindus, Buddhists, Jains, whatever, but now these other people called Portuguese, they have a completely different, they live halfway across the world. So there's something else that's happening at this moment. And I think it's that life of his and how he lived it. That's really the great legacy.
Thank you so much, Srinivas. We have ended exactly on time, and we started exactly on time. And thank you so much to the audience for your patience, for your fascinating questions. Thank you so much for joining us. Please buy and read Srinivas Reddy's book, Krishnadevaraya of Vijayanagara. And we at Takshila Institution hope to see you in our next lecture conversation. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Anirudh. Thank you, everyone. God bless. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Namaste. Do you want me to stay on or?
We'll be ending the session now, Srinivas. So yeah.
Great. Anirudh, wonderful. Thank you so much, man.
Thank you so
Loved
much for
it.
joining us.
Yeah.
And